My allergies do not kill me today. Hey, Liam. Good morning. Welcome to the 4th annual ELAP Conference. I'm Karen Black, Conference MC, and we're so excited to have you join for this year's event. We're embracing the theme ELAP evolution as our laboratory community has adapted to the newly adopted TNI-2 regulations. Over the next 2 days, we'll hear from several laboratories that have used the new regulations as an opportunity to grow in ways that are, well, evolutionary. We hope that you'll have as much fun during the conference as we did planning it. We hope you'll be excited by the stories shared from our fantastic presenters, laugh along with us at our evolution puns, and learn from and be encouraged by those in our community who are pushing progress. Hopefully you've taken a few moments to look over the events to unfold in our conference and perused the agenda. For a quick review, today is ELAP 2.0, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from our very own ELAP staff members. Tomorrow, you'll get to experience evolution in action when you'll hear from several members of our laboratory community as they share some of the great things they're working on. We have an incredible lineup of speakers who are already inspiring the environmental community through amazing transformation, and we get to hear them live over the next 2 mornings. Over 400 people have registered to join us this year, and many have indicated that this is their first time joining us for an ELAP conference. Thank you for being here. Time for a quick bit of housekeeping. We're using Teams Live to accommodate the large number of attendees. As an attendee, you can't unmute yourself or turn your camera on. Any questions you wish to pose to our presenters can be done through the Q&A chat box, and we encourage you to put your name in the space provided. If you experience any technical difficulties, the best way to resolve them is typically to disconnect and rejoin the conference. During today's event, feel free to send in your questions throughout the morning at any time. We will pose the questions to the presenters at the conclusion of their presentation. We also invite you to join the conversation on our Slack channel. Every year, we're able to have great conversations, engage with our presenters, and add a bit of extra to the virtual conference experience. There's a link to join Slack on the conference webpage, and we'll also have it available through a link in the chat box here. We're honored that you've chosen to be here as we celebrate the evolution of our laboratory community as they've made to adopt TNI-2. We always have evolutionary goals with this conference, and this time we really did reach for the man most responsive to change. Our keynote speaker, Robert Brownwood, is the Assistant Deputy Director for the Division of Drinking Water Program Management Branch and has experienced the evolution of the environmental laboratory community during his 30 years of experience in the water industry. During that time, he's worked in every district across California, moving from regulator to regulatee. You may remember him from our second conference as our resident sailor who helped us set our sights and sails towards TNI-2 implementation. This year, Robert is back, and as you are about to find out, he has many stories to share of what he has seen and learned in his years of experience. Please join us in welcoming Robert Brownwood to this year's ELAP conference.
Great, thank you, Karen. Nice introduction, and welcome everyone to the 2024 ELAP-a-thon or ELAP-con, and just really excited to be here and that there's so many attendees and interested in ELAP and what's going on with ELAP and in the lab community. And as you all know, yesterday was Memorial Day, and last night I was just thinking about this morning, of course, and reflecting on Memorial Day as well, and realize that there's quite a bit going on in the world, and talk about change, not always good. And especially there's quite a few wars. According to Amnesty International, there's 110 conflicts going on right now. As we know, the headlines talk about Palestine and Israel and Ukraine and Russia, and there's conflict in the Philippines and Myanmar and Africa. I just like to take a minute to a moment of silence to just contemplate on these things. And so I'm going to turn my camera off and my mic, and we're going to take about a minute, and then I'll be right back, and hopefully we'll all do the same for about a minute. Thank you. All right, a minute can be a long time, not even a minute, but yeah, just sorry about that, but it's just too much on my soul. So um, talk about chemistry and labs and what have you. When I started my college career, and I was somewhat distracted in high school, so took all my chemistry when I got to college, and did really well on the theoretical. Uh, Enjoyed chemistry, loved it, uh, enjoyed learning and all that chemistry had to offer, and but not so much on the labs. The labs, I just honestly, I didn't have the fine motor skills required to be in a wet chemist and be in the lab. And I was one of those students that's when my lab partner asked me what time it was, I was the one who turned the test tube of acid and lost his shirt. And um, fortunately, I was wearing the goggles. And then in the 201 lab, the inorganic chemistry lab, where basically the entire semester was you were given a solution of materials and you had to do all the different dilutions and extractions and adding acids and bases and other solutions that drop out precipitates, and then weigh those out and then do other tests to determine what the compounds were. Didn't do very well, failed that pretty miserably. Again, it got down to just lack of patience in my ADD. As Karen said, I am the assistant deputy director. It's official that I am ADD, and very difficult time in the lab, even though, although I admit the organic chemistry lab, I did get A's in both of those semesters and really enjoyed organic chemistry. But as far as the wet lab material, it wasn't for me. I actually changed my major from chemical engineering and went into civil, but I am grateful for all you who have the patience to work in a lab and go through what's necessary to give the data that we need to do our job and to make sure that we protect public health and the environments here at the Water Board, and as you can provide to your customers, for those in municipal labs, that you can reliably give good information so that your board and your managers can tell the public, yes, our water is safe to drink and meets all standards and surpasses all standards. Probably my favorite chemistry story of all time is a story of Michael Faraday on March 5th, 1823, so over 200 years ago, was in his lab, and he was visited by J.A. Paris. And Paris was walking around his lab and noticed that there's this glassware that had a yellowish, oily substance in it, and he chided Faraday for not keeping a very clean lab. And so after Paris left that next day, Faraday, and he was doing research on chlorine, but he tried to open the test tube, the glassware cover, and the whole bottle exploded, and out came this very pungent odor. And he wrote Paris later that day, he said, "Sir, the substance you saw was chlorine." And I found that very profound, because he knew that his glassware wasn't dirty, and he knew that if there was something in it, it was because he was trying to discover this elemental chlorine. And he did, and he didn't discover it. It was discovered before him, but he confirmed that it was there. And I think he was the one who was able to put down that chlorine was an element. So favorite chemistry story of all time is just that, because it talked about how meticulous these people were in keeping their lab clean and making sure that every bit of information had a reason. I know today, with all our advances in technology, we'll get data, and a lot of times it just doesn't look well, doesn't look good, there's something questionable about it. But it's not a big deal. We're looking at parts per trillion and parts per billion, so there's something there, and where we don't know, and we just kind of excuse it. We have so much technology at a water plant. There's so many alarms. You can have an alarm go off, like the operator just hits a button. Yeah, it goes off all the time. And so pursuing why things happen, I think we're losing that art, but hopefully not too much. So having said that, if Leanne, we can go to my slides. Let's start my presentation. As was mentioned, as you can see in the picture, I sail in the San Francisco Bay, enjoy that, and elsewhere, but primarily the Bay, and it's great pastime. And I started teaching a few years ago, just a beginning class, and it's a 3-day, 8-hour-a-day class. And by the end of it, the students, having never sailed before, the goal is that they can take the boat out the day after they pass the class with someone who's never sailed, and they're going to come back safely. So if you can throw up the checklist, that'd be great. So I'm sure you've not seen, many of you have probably not seen this checklist, but you have your own checklist in the labs. So I'm not a pilot. Darren Polhemus is, and he tells me that they have similar checklists every time they get a plane out. The difference between a boat and a plane is something fails on a boat, you hopefully still float in the water, whereas a plane, you're not floating in the air. But I'm just going to go over this. This is how I teach the students. We go over the checklist, and as we're going over it, we're talking about what each component means and the significance of it. So it's not just checklist. You can see there's a boat name, the skipper's name. I have a student, each student, there's a 3-day class, 3 students, and each student will be the skipper for the day. And, time in, time out, date in, date returned. It's important because if you don't put those things in there, and you take a boat out and there's something wrong with the boat, but you don't put the boat name in there, then the people who are checking the checklist, who run the sailing school, don't know which boat to work on. And I'm not going to go over every item on this checklist, but for purposes for the club who looks at this checklist, they just go down and make sure everything's checked off. It's a quick scan, boom, 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 everything's checked, great. And then they look at the notes, nothing, and they don't have to spend a lot of time on that if we fill it out properly. But you'll notice, like the 4th box down, there's a first aid kit. And Leanne, if you go to the next slide. So here's what the boats look like. We get there, and kind of just like a car, when you look at a car and you rent a car, you want to walk around it, make sure there's no dings on it. And so here's the boat. And I'm showing you the little picture on the right, because that's the cabin. And you can see that milk crate looking cube down there with orange and white things in it. That's where the supplies are kept. A small boat, only 22 feet long. But if you go back to the previous checklist, so first aid kit. I mean, the first aid kit's in a water. It looks like a water bottle, very small. And usually students will just look at it and say, yeah, first aid kit. And I was like, okay, hold on. Let's open up the first aid kit. Let's check out what's in there and make sure if somebody gets hurt, that we have some recourse to correct an injury. And there will be doctors who take this class, or nurses, and it's good because they look at it and we get to talk. It's like, okay, we got a pretty good first aid kit. And usually I never had an injury, but this one class where there were 2 doctors and a nurse, that was, I don't know what happened, but they were all bleeding on the boat by the end of the class. There was the only class that did that. But we checked the first aid kit. This next one is a visual distress signal, and it's just this orange flag, a square flag with 2 black square and a black triangle on it, or a black circle, sorry. And we look at it, and it's like, okay, here's a flag. This is what it looks like. Only hang that up if there's an extreme emergency, not if you just, getting a little scared and you don't want to sail. Just, this is for extreme emergencies. And usually they start folding the flag back up and putting it back in the box. And it's like, well, all right, so we're sitting on the shore, and you saw you go to forward one, back to the picture. We're still at the dock there. Weather's nice, the wind's not blowing, you're in a secluded area. So I don't want them to put the flag back unless they could, at the dock, attach the flag to the boat to show that they can do that. And we spent about 7 minutes trying to figure out how to attach the flag to the boat, which is great. It's beginning class, that's how it should take. But we don't leave until I know they can attach the flag, because if they can't attach it here when we're not moving, they're sure not going to be able to attach it when somebody's laying at the bottom of the boat with a broken leg or bleeding or something and the wind's blowing 25 miles an hour. So you try and do it when everything's great. And even we had one flag and there's 2 ties on it, and there was no ties on this flag. And I go back to the clubhouse, okay, we need some string for this ties, and no one's ever asked for that before. And it's just kind of astounding. It's like, how do instructors not ask for this? How do we not ask for this tie? It's so simple. Well, because very few people actually take out the flag and make sure it would work and they could tie it on the boat. So we got some ties and we put it back on. Sound signal. We'll stay at the picture. The next one on the checklist, you can stay on that picture, then, is a sound signal, right? Sound signal is basically the horn like on your car. And usually we'll show it, we'll make sure it works, but then they put it back in the box. Like, so if you're about to collide with another boat, how much time is it going to take you to jump down there, grab your sound signal, bring it back? So it's like we talk about, now let's leave it up here. There's a practical reason for it. Then if you can go to the next picture. And so here's the blue and the white tubular device. That's the sound signal. And then that's the flag you see you see the strings to tie the flag on. And that metal rod with the black handle, that's a bilge pump handle. And on top of the boat, you can see it. As we look back in the bottom right picture, there's a little, under that black with the red line above it, there's a little square opening, and that bilge pump handle goes in that, and you pump out the bilge if the cabin starts filling with water. And again, a lot of the students want to put that bilge handle back in the box. It's like, well, if the cabin's starting to fill with water, do you want to crawl through the water and try and get out? Why don't we just leave it up on top? And they do. And so we move through that, and then we talk about wind direction, and we go back to the checklist. Sorry, Leanne, making you work. But so we talk about wind direction, wind speed, because that's important, right? It's beginning class, you want to know what the wind's going to do throughout the day. If it's going to be 50-mile-an-hour winds, and we may not want to go out, or it's going to be rainy and windy, and so we plan the day based on that. And then, of course, tides and currents. You want to know that, because the boat only has so much speed under sail and even under motor, and the tides and currents impact how you're going to be able to move in and out of your slip and in and out of the harbor. And then we talk about the standing rigging and running rigging. And if you go back to the first picture, the standing rigging is everything that holds the mast up. It's those cables that you see coming down in front or in back and into the sides of the boat. That's holding the mast on. We talk about that. We check it. And I have them shake the mast to make sure you're shaking this, make sure it's not going to come down. Because if it's going to come down here when everything's peaceful, better to do that now than out in the wind and the high seas. And then the running rigging is all the lines that move the sails. So they're you see these 2 lines coming down from the right of the picture. Those are helping move the sail, and they lift the sail. We check all those things because you want to make sure they work before you go out and you put it in the conditions it's at. And then go to the last picture, please. And so this picture on the left is, that's a little channel we go out, and you can see the dirt there. If you don't stay down those red buoys and go down the center of the channel, you're going to run aground, because sailboats have what's called a keel underneath them, and it hangs down anywhere from 3 to 7 feet. And that's a very low tide, but on a moderate tide, you won't see that mud, but you can still drag your keel in there. And pretty much probably every 3rd or 4th class will we'll see a boat stuck in there. And that's why we did the tides, because if you get stuck, you're going to know that high tide is not coming in for five or 6 more hours. So we're going to be stuck there for 5 or 6 hours. So you want to prepare for that. And we usually watch the boat get stuck there, and we'll talk about it and talk about how to avoid that. So, you don't want to run aground, right? You want to be able to enjoy your day, and very similar to what you all are doing. I mean, TNI has added a lot of checklists, a lot of things that you want to check, and hopefully you never have to deal with it. But we do these checklists on the boat. Go back to the checklist again. We do these checklists because if something were to happen, you run aground or you have an injury or something falls apart on the boat. It's like, okay, did we check it? Yeah, so it was just a broken flange or something. And if you get in an accident, the Coast Guard's going to do all kinds of checks on you. They're going to check your blood alcohol. They're going to check for drugs. They're going to check to make sure your boat is legal, and they're going to look at everything that went wrong. And if someone's injured, it's even more critical. And so very similar to ELAP is, for the most part, we want the data as regulators. Thank you. Great job. Here's the value. We can make a decision. We can determine whether someone's going to have to add treatment or not add treatment based on the value that you as a lab provide for us. If the data is, if there's any suspect, that's where TNI comes in, and that's where these checklists come in. We go back and we look at, all right, where is an error in the data, or can we trust the data? And maybe the labs before, maybe that something changed with the quality of the water, and we need to investigate that. But there's reasons that we have these checklists. There's reasons that TNI, even though we know that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with that. The reality is it's just providing everybody with more information on making sure the data that's presented to us can be trusted and relied upon. And thank you again for attending this training seminar, and I'll send you back to Karen.
Thank you, Robert, for that inspirational presentation and encouraging message. We're going to lean into the evolution mindset with a presentation from our own state agency liaison here with the California Environmental Accreditation Program, Christopher Hand. Christopher is one of ELAP's laboratory certification officers responsible for accrediting drinking water laboratories. He works in coordination with the quality assurance units at the Division of Drinking Water and the Office of Information Management and Analysis at the State Water Board. There are few people I've met who are genuinely as excited about regulation as Christopher. Please welcome him to the ELAP conference stage.
Thank you very much, Karen. I don't know if I'm that excited about regulation, but I do seem to know a lot about it. I'm here today to talk a little bit about effective client communication and the laboratory's role as a scientific educator. If we can move on to the next slide. I want to caveat this by saying I will do my best and have done so in the presentation to include citations where there are specific statutory or regulatory or TNI-based requirements. And I have some of my own guidance and interpretation of those. Please don't conflate the two. I'm trying to keep the regulation separate for those folks that want to reference it from guidance, because what I am going to say isn't always required to be done. So if we can move on to the next slide. Your laboratory has a pretty significant role in communication, and to be an effective communicator, you need to have a couple of things. You need to know the laboratory's rules, what you are required to do. You have to know who you're communicating to and with, and that's specific your audience, so your clients, and what agencies they're reporting to. You have to be proactive. You need to be looking at things in advance prior to conducting any analysis. And then you, at the tail end, need to solicit some feedback and find out what worked well and what didn't. If we move on. And so I like to say that the laboratory's responsibility is not just samples in and numbers out. You do have a responsibility to establish your contract with your client and what the requirements are going to be for them. So if we move on to the next slide. So under the Health and Safety Code, the law that establishes all ELAP accredited laboratories, your laboratory must report in a timely fashion and in accordance with the request for analysis the full and complete results of all detected contaminants and pollutants to the person or entity that submitted the material for testing. So what does that mean? Let's move on to the next slide and let's kind of summarize that and make it a little bit more digestible. So your laboratory needs to know what it is requested to test for, when it needs to report, right, complete and timely, and then is your report full and complete? And kind of what does that mean, particularly for your client? So if we move on to the next slide, there's an additional regulatory section that ELAP has in our regulations that helps explain kind of what that requirement is and what it's required to be. So we have a kind of a general section in 64814.00A, which is state regulatory agencies and federal agencies to whom data is reported may have notification, reporting, and record retention requirements in addition to ELAP's requirements further listed in this section. And it is the laboratory's responsibility to know these additional regulatory requirements. There are very specific requirements for those who do drinking water analysis in 64814 concerning notification when you get an MCL exceedance, notification to the water system's designated contact person if you have to invalidate a sample for a very specific reason, that's typically for bacteria, and where the data needs to be uploaded to. That's incorporated into ELAP's regulations. But those who do work for programs beyond the Division of Drinking Water might have specific requirements that apply to your laboratory when you're working for that specific client. Some of them might have you required to be uploaded to data directly to that agency's database. There's a whole bunch of them. I've included just a small selection here. GeoTracker, Wellstar, CWIX, Smarts for those who do stormwater, and there's way more than I can list here because ELAP services over 20 different state agencies, each with a dozen or so programs, and each has their own reporting requirements and typically has their own database. We'll go to the next slide. In addition to the specific regulatory language that ELAP has, we also incorporate the 2016 TNI standard by reference, making all of those also regulatory requirements. For those who have seen it on ELAP's YouTube page, we do have a brief training on all the sections, including section 4.4, as I have highlighted here. I'll walk through it quickly. We also have learner material that goes with that. And if you haven't seen those or heard of those, or you don't have that learner material, you can email ELAP's general inbox, elapca@waterboards.ca.gov, and request the learner material or request a link. It's on ELAP's website as well. So if you want to directly navigate it there, that's a great resource if you haven't seen it. So what is section 4.4 talking about? Well, it's really talking about your laboratory's need for a procedure that establishes what testing your laboratory is going to be doing at the beginning before work begins. So you have to review any request, contract, tender. They call them kind of all equivalent, but work that you're doing in your laboratory would be one of these things. And what it's asking you to look for is like, What's the client requesting, right? It fits in with that statutory mandate. What are those requirements? What are the methods that need to be used? Does your lab actually have the ability to do all this work? Are you too busy? Are you going to need to subcontract? What happens when that occurs? Are you selecting the right method? Are you selecting the right test procedure that meets their specific requirements? And I'll touch on that in a little bit more specificity when I go into my guidance discussion. And then any differences between what's requested and what's delivered should be resolved before any work commences. Each contract needs to be acceptable to both the laboratory, right? You can't test for something that you don't normally do, and then each customer, right? Does this meet your client's regulatory needs? If we go to the next slide, there's more in T&I in section 4.4. And this is really about what happens if the work changes, either before, during, or after, right? You have to maintain records of what discussions you had with your customer. If you're calling on the phone, maybe you write a note, and that's the record, right? Talk to so-and-so on time, request to change, blah, 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 right? Or maybe it's an email that you're retaining, or maybe it's some other form of communication that you have that's documented. Your procedures and your review needs to cover any work that you subcontract, right? You need to notify your clients ahead of time that say, hey, we're not doing this analysis in-house. We're sending this to this laboratory. They're also ELAP accredited, and how that's going to work. If for some reason your laboratory needs to deviate from your contract, right? You can't do a specific thing. How is the customer being informed of that change? What's your laboratory's procedure? If it's going to be amended at any point, you still have to follow your same established laboratory's procedure. So we move on to the next slide. On top of all of the statutory and regulatory and T&I based requirements, every method's going to have something as well, right? They have method acceptance criteria or sampling procedures. Some have specific bottles that things need to go in. Some have specific field tests that need to be taken to confirm that they're collecting the sample. Some have specific sampling criteria. If you're under one of those interesting regulatory programs, they have very specific sampling criteria that you need to collect. And if your lab doesn't do the sampling themselves, you got to communicate with the client to ensure that they know what they need to do while they're in the field. We've heard some interesting stories of samplers just bringing in disposable water bottles like those pictured here. That's probably not going to be acceptable for volatile analysis, right? So what kind of procedure does your lab have in place to make sure your method requirements are met? Next slide. Moving on to topic 2, you really have to know what your audience is. And that's where I'm going to lean more into the guidance area because, like I said, we have a lot of different regulatory programs that you could be involved in, and I'm trying to be as generic as I possibly can. Next slide. T&I does have a section that's saying you have to be willing to cooperate with the customers and clarifying what their request is. You can't just accept something and not kind of clarify if it's not clear what you need to be doing. And so in that regard, you do have to actually talk to your client. You do actually have to discuss options with them if it's not clear. Next slide. But not everyone you're going to be discussing options with is a laboratory pro. Some folks may know a lot about laboratory communication and what your lab needs to do, and some might only have the analytes. I know I need to look for nitrate, but they don't really know anything beyond that. So what do they need to have to sample, right? What materials do they need? Can they get bottles from you? Do they need to order bottles from somewhere else? Do they need to test anything when they're sampling? Do they need to have specific criteria? What method do they pick? If your laboratory offers both 300.0 and 300.1, this is your opportunity to advise them which one you should select based on what their needs are. But you're only going to be able to advise them if you know your client's regulatory purpose. The better you know their purpose, the better advice you can give. And TI does have a note in the standard basically highlighting that customers value good, open communication. The especially when they're doing a large amount of work, right? And making sure that communication is open and I'm going to say high level and not too in the weeds. The customer's going to appreciate that. We'll move on to the next slide. So before your beginning analysis, I have kind of a list of topics that you should be discussing with your client. So how does your laboratory establish your contract with your client before you accept samples? And how does your laboratory document any minor additions, right? Do you note all of the work ahead of time? Is that logged somewhere beforehand, or are you logging anything and deviations on the chain of custody, right? Do you have that noted there of what bottles go with what samples and what tests need to be done? Are they listing just analytes, or are they listing methods? What are you documenting in your chain of custody to make sure that's clear with the sampler? If that chain of custody doesn't line up with what you had discussed beforehand, well, how do you document your changes that are made, right? How do you rectify that discrepancy? If your chain of custody says they need to test for lead, but you didn't discuss testing lead with your customer at all beforehand, how is that change communicated? How are you confirming what you need to do? Is everything identified, right? What analysis do you need to do? What methods do you need to use? If you're going to be subcontracting things, the subcontracting laboratory will have the same kind of information that they're going to require, right? They're also an ELAP accredited laboratory. They're going to need to know the same kind of things. Where's the data going to go? And what is your client going to do with that, right? Those two questions are vitally important to understanding your client's regulatory purpose, right? What is the question, or what is your client going to do with the data that you're providing them? We move on to the next slide. So a little bit more information, because if you have blind analysis, you're just going to have blind results. And the clients are really the key to your laboratory's success. The need is important, but how the data is going to be used and where it's going is also important. And as just a highlighted example of vital data to your clients, if you're doing drinking water analysis, if you get scheduled analysis, you have pretty routine, your lab knows what you're doing. So let's say micro, right? You got scheduled micro. You're going to schedule it earlier in the week because micros isn't instantaneous and you has a short holding time. So you don't really want to be working on the weekend. So you're going to do it Monday through Wednesday, routine analysis. You report it whenever you have your notification procedures, et cetera, et cetera. If that same client's giving you a weird sample, an extra sample that you're not expecting on an unusual day, what if it's a boiled water notice? That data is needed to make sure your client's community can continue. When they're on boiled water notice, a lot of the time, you're not even going to be able to run any businesses, right? The businesses that serve food. Nobody's going to be able to do anything with that boil water notice. They're waiting to revitalize their community. And if you don't have that information and you don't know how important that sample is, that level of service isn't going to be beneficial to your clients. So we move on to the next slide. And this is where a couple other highlighted examples of where client communication is vitally important. And what regulatory purpose does this meet? There are a lot of programs and a lot of competing requirements, and this is the highlighted example of a couple of highlighted examples of where a lack in communication can lead to drastically different outcomes. So we move on to the next slide. So example number 1. These are all made up numbers and all made up analysis, but we have sample number 2024-01, and on the chain of custody, it's listed as surface water for volatile organic chemicals. What does that mean? There are 2, potentially more, applications where it could be any of these. If it's a pre-treatment drinking water source, well, now it falls under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It falls under a bunch of EPA requirements under 40 CFR 141. It falls under the Division of Drinking Water requirements. The data's got to be uploaded to CLIP. There should be a water system number and a location ID for sampling, and maybe you want to use EPA 524.4 as the method that you can use. But if it's not a pre-treatment drinking water source, maybe it's a wastewater influent, and it needs to be monitored under the Clean Water Act. Well, now there's a different set of EPA rules that it's going to fall under. It's going to fall under 40 CFR 136. Maybe you want to use EPA 624.1 instead. Maybe those are the methods. What if it's neither of those? How would you know what method your laboratory is allowed to use? Next slide. Another example. This is sample 2024-02, groundwater, and they're looking for metals analysis. Well, again, where is that data going? What is that regulatory purpose? Is it, again, it's a Safe Drinking Water Act sample? It's pre-treatment drinking water source. So monitoring straight from the well. They're looking for all the metal contaminants there. Well, you got to use 200.8 because that's an approved method under 40 CFR 141. It's got to be uploaded to CLIP. You have a bunch of other criteria that you might need to follow. Or maybe it's a site cleanup, right? If they're have a bunch of groundwater monitoring wells to show that the cleanup effort is working, well, that program or permit is maybe requiring a specific method. Maybe 200.8 is acceptable, but maybe not. Maybe you have to use 6020 or 6020B if you're using the same ICP-MS. Again, you have to know where your data is going and what purpose it serves in order for your laboratory's communication and establishment of need is going to be effective. Go to the next slide. And here's where I'm going to advocate for your laboratory to be proactive. Because being proactive and establishing need beforehand is really vital and is really going to establish your criteria well. We move on to the next slide. So this is a common question that ELAP gets of why does ELAP or doesn't ELAP offer method X or analysis Y, and kind of where the regulatory landscape looks like based on my personal experience. We move to the next slide. So our program works with a ton of different agencies. We have a team of chemists, environmental scientists, microbiologists. We have some of the industry's experts in some of these areas, but we don't know every program. We have a program that can that can be used for a large variety of different programs here. These are just a couple of the agency pictures highlighted here, each of which uses ELAP to some degree. Some use it a lot more than others, right? I'm sure everyone here has some form of water boards based program that they're reporting data to. That's definitely our largest client by far, but there's a bunch of other programs that we work with as well. And we credit laboratories that generate data for a wide variety of these. If we go to the next slide. We have fields of accreditation that you all are familiar with. They're on a bunch of different tables. These are what state agencies are requesting ELAP to offer. The specific program has specific rules and processes that determine what methods may or may not be used. Each one of those has their own way of establishing this, and ELAP cannot keep track of all 20 of these. As much as I personally would like to, it's just not something that we're set up for, because there are too many different agencies and too many different programs that data could be going to. So our fields of accreditation are established to identify what matrix is being monitored, right? That's drinking water, but drinking water could be pre or post treatment, right? As we discussed earlier, but it's labeled as drinking water. What methods are we offering, right? Those are pretty familiar in the laboratory world. We all have an idea of what EPA 200.7 means. We all have an idea of what standard methods section is required for solids analysis and which letter corresponds to which residue analysis, that kind of thing. And what analyte, right? What specifically are you looking for? Are you looking for lead? Are you looking for 1,2,3 TCP? What's the analyte? Not every field of accreditation we offer is going to be acceptable to every program. Some programs have specific criteria. You must use this. Some programs don't care. They're like, as long as ELAP offers it, you can use it. They don't even have that matrix requirement. So that's kind of the limit of where ELAP can provide guidance, is we can say these are the FOAs we offer, but we're not going to necessarily be able to provide you with clarity of whether this FOA is going to be acceptable for your program. Next slide. We don't write any monitoring. We don't, there's no requirement that ELAP writes that requires anyone to look for any specific thing. The most monitoring we require is for laboratories to perform PET analysis. That's kind of the extent of our monitoring requirement, right? So when we get laboratories or dischargers or other regulated entities coming to ELAP to request us to offer something different or ask if the method can be used to comply, we can provide guidance in terms of, well, we know that program X allows Y, but we're not going to be able to say with any amount of certainty that, yes, this FOA can be used for your program, right? We have a lot of familiarity with the Safe Drinking Water Act and a lot of familiarity with the Clean Water Act, and so we're generally more comfortable answering those kinds of questions, but we're not going to be able to say with certainty that it'll meet your permit requirements. And by the time ELAP is offering FOAs, it's often too late to change what method can be used for that specific monitoring, because that specific information is often set up in that permit that's used for that specific site, or the DDW regulation that establishes that need, or EPA mandating that only these methods can be used for this specific rule, right? Only these methods can be used for the surface water treatment rule. Only these methods can be used for the new PFAS rule, right? So ELAP's just offering what methods are required by other agencies. Go to the next slide. So remember that question earlier? What is your client going to do with your data? Well, if you have one client, your captive laboratory, your municipal laboratory, and you have one agency that all your data goes to, and you don't work for anyone else, you're only working for your agency, well, you probably have a huge advantage because you have a permit that has, these are all the things that we need to test for. These are all the methods that you're allowed to use. Those permits have the development processes when they're renewing to establish those needs. So you have that advantage to be able to provide information and expertise on, oh, well, we should use this method to look for this thing because our laboratory can do it, or we know our subcontract laboratory does this a lot, right? But you do need to be aware of the changing landscape, especially if you're a commercial laboratory, of what's coming down in the pipeline. Like I said, ELAP doesn't write rules or mandate specific monitoring. We're the kind of the last stop. We're the ones that offer the accreditation that's needed for that specific monitoring. So, for example, the new US EPA rule for PFAS in drinking water. That has 2 methods established that must be used for that monitoring. Luckily, ELAP's a little ahead of the game. Here in California, we offer both of those methods. But that's the new EPA rule. And again, that's not something that ELAP is writing. It's not something that ELAP is mandating, but that's something that your laboratory should be aware of, especially if you're looking to maintain suitability as you move towards the future. So next slide. And lastly, after your analysis is complete, you want feedback, right? The goal of any laboratory should be continuous improvement, right? What I did is great, but how can I do it better? So next slide. And you have to solicit feedback because you must, right? One of those is, well, I'm doing it because I have to, which is fine, but maybe you want to make it work, right? So I highlighted 2 sections from T9 here, 4.7.2 and 4.8. You have to have a policy or procedure for complaints. If you get somebody saying analysis A didn't meet my expectation, how are you resolving that? What investigations do you do? But you also have to proactively seek feedback, right? You have to encourage people to apply, not just through complaints, right? If you did something really well and you knocked it out of the park, you want to know that too. You want to do that every time. That satisfaction is going to really anticipate and kind of guide your laboratory forward. Next slide. But it is also useful to collect feedback. Fixes any errors that you may have had, improves the performance moving forward, right? If you had a weird sample and you got weird results and you got feedback saying, hey, well, this thing, but we did it at another lab concurrently and they did this thing, that maybe that's going to help your laboratory move forward. It also builds trust. You're not hiding anything. You're not trying to obfuscate the reasons for your results. It's going to help build that trust with your client, whether that's the one client that you always have or whether that's many clients. And I'll be honest, laboratory articles published about laboratories generally aren't positive. You generally don't get an article written about you when you do something amazing. And especially in the environmental world, the articles that get written are, oh my gosh, this bad thing is in the water and it wasn't known because the laboratory messed up the test, right? You want to stay out of those articles. You don't want to be in those things. So soliciting feedback outside of, oh my gosh, the world is ending article is going to be much more helpful towards the future. We move on to the next slide. That's all I have. I hope this topic was useful to many of you. I see that we do have a couple of questions here, so I'll pass those off to Karen to kind of ask.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for the perspective and encouragement to implement these practices. As a reminder to our audience, feel free to type in your questions throughout the presentations, and we'll post them here to the presenters at the end of their presentations. Or feel free to head over to our Slack channel to join the conversation there. So some of the questions we've received for Chris. Based on your experience in ELAP, how many California laboratories do you think are doing an effective job of working with clients on the endpoint of data? And are there any areas of regulatory work that this is better or worse or harder to do?
That's a great question. For number of laboratories, that's a little harder for me to say because I usually get filtered the good and the bad through the agencies that ELAP works with. So like Karen mentioned at the very beginning, I work really closely with the quality assurance sections in both DDW and the water boards in general. And so I'll get the good news of the labs that are doing things well ahead of time. And so we'll kind of have that idea there, but I've seen names and I note which labs are doing a good job. But in general, those that communicate directly with their clients and those that advocate for their clients when working with agencies directly tend to have a better job, right? So a lot of the times you'll have like a middleman or a client that is collecting the sample and kind of handles everything for the ultimate agency that the data gets reported to. And the better communicators generally know, generally have the better idea of what that agency is going to be requiring, because they're aware of the agencies that they're doing work for. So I would say that's the best way, is to know directly and advocate with your client, when you're communicating directly to the agency where the data is going to be going. Generally have a better job of working with those.
Great, thanks, Chris, for that answer. And we have another question that's similar to what you just mentioned about middleman. What should labs do for hazardous waste testing, for example, when there is a middleman like a consultant who brings in the samples and may not know where the data is going?
In that case, you do have to try a little bit harder to get the best and most useful information. I know you're not going to be able to do it with everyone. Not everyone is an expert on all of the things that they're doing. Some folks are just more curious or being proactive. Like, I want to test this thing because I know it will probably be regulated. And so in that regard, you have to treat them as much as you can as a regulatory sample, right? Expect the data to be used for compliance at some point down the line. And so I've seen labs that have the disclaimer on all their pages of their reports that say you have to publish the report in its full and complete form. That does really help. You'd be surprised at how many times I get sent a snippet of a lab report, and it's just the results and all of the case narrative that says, hey, actually this sample was crazy when we accepted it in the laboratory wasn't included. And having that information in your lab report, kind of highlighting that, well, we had a sample, it was unusual, we communicated with this, blah, 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 blah. That'll help protect you, should anything nefarious come of it, let's say.
Great, thanks. And we'll do questions until 10 o'clock. So I have another one here. Feel free to continue to put those questions in the chat for us. Do any laboratories have a standard form or procedure to clarify what the client is asking for data-wise? And what are some ways that labs could try to standardize this process?
So that's a little bit harder for me to answer, because the standard sections that I highlighted, they are showing you what you are required to do, but not how you are required to do it. So your lab has a lot of flexibility in kind of establishing what you need to do or how you need to coordinate that. And so some labs have a standard kind of contracting form, where sorry, I'm getting a lot of things here. They have a standard kind of contracting form where they're collecting that information ahead of time, right? So what general category of sample is it? What kind of established procedure are you looking for? They'll have a notification like, I need these things. Do I have specific methods, or can the laboratory pick what method? Some labs have like standard and filled out like items to include on a chain of custody. So they'll let you fill out exactly what methods you need to use and what analytes you're looking for and what sample is associated with that in the chain of custody. Some will have those as like pre-printed filled out things where you send that all to the client and then the client fills that out in the field. So exactly how you do it is going to be up to your laboratory. But there are multiple ways, and whatever way works best for you. Right? You don't have to do it a specific way if that doesn't work. We'd like to see you to be able to innovate wherever you can. All right, I see it's 10 o'clock, and I see other questions in the chat, in the Q&A section. So I will work behind the scenes to respond to those that have been asked. So if you have more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and I will work to answer them as the next presentation moves forward.
Great. Thanks, Chris. We appreciate that. At this time, we're going to ELAP's very own assessment unit, where we'll hear from Maria Friedman. Maria manages the assessment unit of the California Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program and is a member of the program's management team. She has more than 25 years of experience in multiple roles in the environmental laboratory industry, and she has served as the quality manager for commercial laboratories in California for 11 years. She is a U.S. EPA certification officer for organic and inorganic chemistry, microbiology, and parasitology, covering things like Cryptosporidium and Giardia in drinking water. She is a certified ISO IEC 17025 lead assessor and a certified quality auditor and a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt. She holds an MBA and a BS in chemical engineering. Please welcome Maria to the ELAP conference stage.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am Maria Friedman, and I'm here to put the spotlight on ELAP on-site assessments. Next slide, please. When we do an ELAP OSA, here's what we look for: method compliance, CCR compliance, and 2016 TNI compliance. Hence, sometimes we have to do your lab more than a day, maybe 2 or 3 depending on your accreditation scope. We plan with you. We also look for best practices in the lab and obtain permission to share such best practices to other labs. We strive to inspire labs, embrace the challenge of accreditation, collaborate, and reinforce commitment to quality. Next slide, please. Today, we focus on how the ELAP OSA process has evolved with the adoption of the 2016 TNI standard. Next slide, please. So let's review the ELAP OSA process, which begins when the lab requests an ELAP OSA. So when we receive the request, the ELAP assessor calls the lab to schedule the OSA. When that's scheduled, the ELAP assessor sends the lab the OSA notification letter, and the notification letter confirms the dates of the assessment, provides the agenda, and requests pre-assessment documents. When the schedule for the assessment has come, we are at your lab, then we send you the report, then you respond to the OSAR, the report, and that's considered CAP 1. When the ELAP assessor receives and reviews CAP 1 and everything is okay, then you get a closure letter and acceptance letter. If there are issues in CAP 1 that still need resolutions or further actions, then we send back to you CAP 1 for you to do CAP 2. And then the process restarts. When we receive it, we review your response and then issue a closure letter. So the closure letter may not be a complete acceptance letter. It could be other things depending on the resolutions from CAP 2. So we'll discuss those in detail. Next slide, please. So let's go back to our first step, which is lab requesting an ELAP OSA. Remember, depending on the type of accreditation you are seeking, there are different timelines when the OSA must be completed. So therefore, please schedule your ELAP OSA ahead of time. The ELAP scheduling tool in the ELAP website and link shown here will help you avoid a situation where you won't have sufficient time to complete the OSA in time. And many labs have seen this schedule and are actually using it, so that's good. Next slide, please. So now when the OSA has been scheduled, we send you an OSA notification letter, And I just want to highlight here some of the pre-assessment docs requirements that we would like to emphasize to be properly sent. The QA manual that you send, the SOPs, they must be those currently in use, and some copies are the ones that we would like to receive. Make sure the quality manual is compiled into a single document instead of separate files. And if you are sending PDFs, they must be searchable. Submit all applicable pre-assessment documents and records. Please do not send links to a SharePoint. Do not send hard copies, but it's okay to submit the documents and records as separate attachments in emails. Next slide, please. So now we are at your lab. We're conducting the OSA. We will review compliance to relevant regulations, including methods, the CCR, and the TNI standard. So as you may already know, and mostly for the labs we assess, ELAP assessments have always focused on method compliance. This has not changed. As quality systems underpin every result, the laboratory reports, assessors also look for evidence of an effective quality system. And I'd like to underscore the method requirements supersede those of TNI unless TNI is more stringent. Next slide, please. So when we are at your lab, we interview the analysts, we observe the procedures they perform, we review analytical records, including support equipment. And please ensure that if documents or records are requested to be viewed, they must be readily accessible, available on the spot, or at the latest before the OSA closing meeting. Make sure the laboratory protocols, the primary or principal or approved present for it. The accreditation is being posted in the laboratory. So do not stash away your certificate in the drawer. Be proud of your education. Next slide, please. So the TNI standard is known to emphasize quality systems, and it does. But you will find many of its requirements are not really new to ELAP. For example, a traceability finding given 2 years ago would have a CCR reference. And today, the same finding would be issued with a TNI reference. The finding itself is the same. So here's a sampling of previous CCR requirements that are also required today under TNI. See how many of them you recognize. So first, the quality manual and SOPs to include effective revision numbers and approval signatures. You must review such documents annually. You must have a sample acceptance rejection policy. Next slide, please. Certificates of analysis and certificates of calibration must contain expiration dates. The vendors must be assigning the expiration dates to your reference standards and materials, not you. Preventive action processes to detect and prevent potential problems must be in place. And what is the best preventive action? Okay, that's training. So we make sure that your staff are trained, timely trained, properly trained, and have records of such training. Next one is for the entire laboratory operation must be completed once per year. And remember, these internal audits, you don't have to spend the entire day, sit in one day, reviewing all laboratory operations. It could be segmented throughout the year as you have supporting records that you are doing it. And one good way to do is create a log and record every single thing, every single issue, or even not an issue that even best practices that you put in the log. And at the end of the year, you won't even know you're finished with your internal audit. So that's just an example. And many labs, we have suggested that to the labs we assess, and I believe they are successful with it. Next one is internally validated spreadsheets. If you created spreadsheets or calculation spreadsheets with formulas, they must be locked. You must have equipment ID in records for traceability, record them, same as lot number of standards and reagents in the records. Next slide, please. Corrective action systems must be in place. All instruments and support equipment are uniquely labeled. Use of indelible ink, no pencils. No access to obsolete documents. No illegible handwriting. And last but not least, data integrity and ethics training must be in place. There must be a refresher every year. Next slide, please. So now what's new? So remember, this is just a sampling. Okay, there are so many things that are new as well. I just put in here a few. You must have now a master list of documents that includes your quality systems documents, SOPs, quality manual, and even equipment manual. You must have a list of major laboratory equipment. The quality manual must now include the table of contents. You must have a signature verification form. It's for anyone responsible for signing or initialing any lab records. You must have evidence of data logbook review at least quarterly, and that also applies to electronic logs. And remember, this is not solely for the technical manager to do. Anyone trained and approved by the technical manager can do the review as long as they understand what to review and they are trained. And mainly this is for a sanity check. Next slide, please. So we need to have a laboratory, a statement in your quality manual toward a commitment towards continuous improvement and service to the clients. There must be a backup of electronic records, a separate storage for samples from standards, must conduct management reviews, and if you are keeping hard copies within the laboratory premises, they must be accessed only with the log so that anybody taking in data that had been stored, you will be able to track that they are returning such hard copies. Tag out all instrumentations or items that are still in the lab but not operational. Next slide, please. So requirements open tell you what you must do, but not how. That's why assessors are always watchful for best practices. Labs are encouraged to share their experiences with others. ELAP wants you to succeed. When you succeed, we succeed. We are not your adversary. Our primary goal is protect public health, and you are integral. You are our ally for making that happen. So we have an ulterior motive for you to do well. Next slide, please. So now these are some of the do's and don'ts. So be prepared. We're going to be looking for this. For analyst demonstration of capability, I want to point out that these are laboratory location specific, not organization specific. When an analyst works at a new location in their organization, that analyst is exposed to new conditions. For example, different equipment, different instrument performance, and MDLs, different environmental conditions. Therefore, an analyst working at a different location, even for the same organization, must complete a new DOC in the new or a different location before analyzing compliance samples. Similarly, and continuing on DOCs, the records would need approval and authorization from management before the analyst can analyze samples. And please ensure that the SB in effect at the time of the DOC is referenced in the records. Next slide, please. Analysts must read reference methods. They must have input in writing revising SOPs. In fact, they should be the one reviewing the SOPs in the first place. So make sure they have input. Laboratory, of course, must have operational calibrated equipment to analyze samples for specific methods. I want to add here that there must be a daily check of the IR gun because we have observed that's not common in laboratories using IR gun. Do not use cheap or cracked glassware. And why not? Aside from being a health and safety issue, it could introduce contamination. They're hard to clean and potentially cause measurement errors. Next slide, please. So this is about using a bottled water purchased from store, for example, Arrowhead or Sparklets, and use as reagent water for microbiology purposes. If you do this, they must meet reagent water quality requirements. You will not be able to rely on a test report from the manufacturer because they often do not provide traceability between the report and each bottle of water. So if that is the case, and you want to continue using the bottled water, you would have to perform testing, your own testing, or subcontract the testing on the individual bottles to meet the requirement. Of course, if the manufacturer can provide you a lot with several bottles in a lot, then you can choose one bottle to verify the entire lot. Use of bleach alone to disinfect microbiological waste is not permitted. And why? There could be inadequate coverage, microorganism resistance, hazardous reaction with other materials, incomplete disinfection. So there are other mechanisms on how to disinfect microbiological waste. And you can use your autoclave, you can use bio bags, you can have somebody, another organization pick up the waste. Next slide, please. If you have an FOA that you only use for process control, make sure they must meet compliance requirements because you requested them in your FOA, so it is expected that you will meet the requirements. Any corrective actions or all corrective actions require monitoring for effectiveness and closure. As an example, in the maintenance log, if there's some maintenance or repair done, you've got to identify the what, who, when, where, why, how, and most important, the back to control. You don't want any corrective actions left not closed because you could be questioned, well, this item didn't say that it has been fixed and why are you using such equipment? So look for such details. Next slide, please. So now we're done with the assessment. We sent you the report. Now you respond to the OSAR. Do not forget to send additional documents to the assessor if requested. Remember earlier we said that any documents, records requested at the latest must be submitted prior to the closing meeting, but with arrangements, with congruence of your assessor, then those items may be submitted later on. But do not forget to send them. And we will also follow up with you. Follow instructions in the OSAR on how to respond to findings. Include root cause analysis. Aside from being in the ELAP instructions in the OSAR, it's also a TNI requirement. So gather data, analyze the data, identify root causes. The simplest tool is the 5 whys. I also put in here the option, the fishbone diagram. If you have the opportunity to check into it, that is also a great tool to use. Next slide, please. Correcting a finding while the OSA was in progress does not relieve the laboratory from fully responding with the corrective action that will prevent recurrence. And as you all know, those we assess, not everything that's discussed during on-site would be a finding. So we will review all the pertinent documentation, requirements, regulations, etc. We would be referencing any citation into the report. Complete them and correct actions when you say they will be, as you say you'll do. Next slide, please. So now we receive your response, and we're going to review that response. The first round of laboratory response, they are collectively termed CAP 1. The second round is collectively termed CAP 2. However, there could be very easy fixes that are expected to be completed with supporting documentation of completion. So please send those to us. Next slide, please. When we review your report, there are only 3 dispositions, either acceptable, not acceptable, or incomplete. If you do not respond to a specific finding or to any finding, then you will be marked not acceptable. If any response is ambiguous, incomprehensible, disorganized, then that's also not acceptable. Any response marked not acceptable or incomplete in CAP 1 will be returned with explanation, and you have to do CAP 2. Next slide, please. So unresolved findings in CAP 2 will be forwarded to ELAP management for final decision. And that could be denying a specific FOA, revoke the entire certificate, issue an interim certificate, refer to enforcement or other appropriate action. So I want to remind everyone there is no CAP 3. Next slide, please. So here are the references that we check out, we read, we examine. The 2016 TNI standard, it will tell you what ELAP expects from your quality management systems. The California Code of Regulations, it documents the regulations under which ELAP operates and provides essential information to you about the accreditation process and requirements that must be followed to be accredited by ELAP. There is the Health and Safety Code. It contains the statutes that govern ELAP and provides information about penalties or non-compliance. Next slide, please. And still more references. TNI uses the standard interpretation request process to provide clarity on parts of the standard that may be ambiguous. And you can use what you call the SIR to ask questions about the TNI standard. There are also TNI guidance documents. Those are free publications available on the TNI website. They provide useful information about how to comply with TNI requirements. And most of them are regarding instrument calibration, detection and quantitation limits, and PT reporting levels or PTRLs. And of course, there's the Code of Federal Regulations, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. They contain federal regulations governing wastewater and drinking water analysis. Last but not least, the Drinking Water Manual. The EPA's manual for the certification of laboratories analyzing drinking water contains important guidance for drinking water laboratories. So check it out. You can't go wrong if you follow that. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, assessment is a sampling activity. Not everything can be found in those days that we are at your laboratory. That could apply to multiple areas in the laboratory must be corrected. Even those other areas were not mentioned in the OSAR. So the assessment process is a tool for continuous improvement and excellence. Engage with the laboratory community for support, sharing best practices, and staying informed about industry trends. A strong commitment to quality not only ensures compliance, but also enhances the reliability and credibility of the analytical results that you produce. Next slide, please. So all labs are expected to transition to the 2016 TNI standard for quality systems. There was a grace period and early, and those that are already TNI labs. But for most, this is new and is similar to when you're new in driving a car, you struggle, you try to follow the road rules and not get a ticket or into an accident. But as time passes by, you become adept or even an expert. And so now you don't even notice you're pressing the brake. It is understood that documentation is a keyword in TNI implementation. I've given you a taste of the ELAP OSA process in the time we have today. I hope you have learned something new from us, and we look forward to seeing you at your next OSA. Let's all embrace the challenge and succeed. That's the only way to go. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you,
I
Maria.
think that's it. You're welcome.
That was great. That was a lot of information. So we'll have questions from Maria until 10:30 a.m. So go ahead and put those in the Q&A box for us. We have a few so far. You may have covered this a little bit, but just to reiterate, what happens if my CAP 2 is not accepted?
When CAP 2 is not accepted, so we first work it out with you. Sometimes there might just be misunderstanding, or maybe there are still records that you can support, so we can consider accepting the further actions. So we don't give it right away to the next step, right? We first work with you. And if we can resolve it, then we will accept the CAP. However, in instances that no, you don't want to comply and you can't do it, etc., then we definitely have to move to our next step in our ELAP management. And that's when I said they're going to work on they're going to decide what's going to happen to your certificate. But of course, like I said, the key is we'll work with you, and we expect that you work with us to close this and you get your certificate.
Great, thank you. Another good question. We currently review the quality assurance manual annually, but it's difficult to review all of the SOPs or standard operating procedures annually. Is this acceptable?
All right, the requirement is review annually. And remember, there's also that internal audit component that you must do internal audit of your entire lab operations annually. So I would say that, and that's why I mentioned in the presentation, have your analysts do it, right? Get started. And I would say as long as you get started and someone is looking in it and someone overseeing that is not neglected, and now it's 3 years later, we haven't completed it, then definitely that's a no-no. So we want you to be aware, you'll be always on top. And I understand there could be many SOPs in the laboratory, but you must ensure that the process has started.
Okay, thank you. Is it ever too early to schedule our on-site assessment?
No. You can schedule it at any time, but remember, when you submit your renewal, it's 90 days, or renewal, or I guess amendment could be any time, but renewal, you have 90 days. So really the expiration of your certificate is 90 days before the actual expiration. So we have labs that request OSAs, but they want to be assessed not till December. So it's okay to be in the queue, and actually that's better for us as well, so we can plan ahead and give us ample time, and yourselves as well, to be ready. Use the scheduling tool. It's really great. Actually, Christopher Hanley designed that, right, Chris? So we're here to help you.
I designed the first one. I think it's moved on since then, and it's gotten a lot prettier and a lot cleaner. So keep use it if you can.
Great, Maria. We've got one more question for you before we move on. Can you please elaborate on daily check for IR gun? Where is this requirement from, and what is the criteria?
Okay, that requirement is posted in SM 9020 I believe, is section B4A. So every day, so we know that annually or preferably semi-annually, you're verifying the calibration of that IR gun. But on a daily basis, as you use it, you also need to do a check. And you look at what temperature you typically use the IR gun on a daily basis. Typically, it may be ambient or a chill temperature. And you can choose one. So you will verify it. Let's say it's chilled, right? So if it's chilled, have a temp blank inside the refrigerator, so it's always chilled. And you should have your reference thermometer. You have your IR gun. So shoot the temp blank with an IR gun and check it with your reference thermometer. And the difference in the reading cannot be or must not be greater than 0.5. Otherwise, you're going to have to do a verification, another verification of that IR gun. And if it's an ambient temperature, you typically receive samples and just put as a temp blank on the bench. Similarly, do check with the IR gun, check with the reference thermometer, and if the difference between the two readings is greater than 0.5, then another recalibration. And how you do, I'm sorry, not recalibrate, you can send it out, but you must have another thermometer in the lab, or you can do a re-verification. So how do you do the re-verification, annually or semi-annually? So you check it at different points, at the chill temperature, at ambient temperature, and also at a warmer temperature. Does that answer the question?
I think that's good, Maria. Thank you.
Okay.
Next, I would like to introduce our speaker, Michael Head. Michael recently joined California ELAP in his current position as the supervisor for the Program Development, Research, and Enforcement Unit. Michael has more than 20 years of experience in multiple roles. His previous state positions include assisting a state agency lab in continuous improvement efforts and investigating fraud cases at the Water Board's Office of Enforcement. Today, he's going to share with us some insight into compliance in the laboratory. Please welcome Michael.
Thanks, Karen. Appreciate that. So my talk today is called Compliance Every Day Keeps Enforcement Away, and with a little subtitle, Up, Down, Left, Right, Strategies for Compliance. Next slide, please. So thanks to Chris Hand, who I stole this disclaimer from. Just again, note that I'm going to be presenting material that I put together, and that these are my views and don't necessarily reflect any of the official views of ELAP or the Water Board. And I did my best to ensure that it was accurate, but that what I say here does not replace regulatory requirements or guidance posted on ELAP's official channels. All right, next slide. Okay, I have an additional disclaimer. Sticking with our evolutionary theme, I wanted to mention a quote from British evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane. So in 1934, and I'm paraphrasing here, said, if a creator exists, then that creator has an inordinate fondness for beetles. I also have a degree in evolution and ecology. I love beetles, but I also love Super Mario Brothers. So I'm going to have that thrown into the mix here a little bit. And hopefully you find some joy in that, and if not, that you tolerate it. For all those old school video game geeks out there, I'm aware that up, down, left, right is not a code in Super Mario Brothers, and that a similar code was used by Capcom games, starting with Contra and some others. But anyway, we won't go there. But I just wanted to mention that I do understand that. But I love the up, down, left, right reference. Next slide, please. All right. So today we're going to talk about ELAP enforcement. I'm going to introduce the unit, and we'll start by what our charge is, what our mission is. So we ensure that ELAP accredited labs that submit data for regulatory purposes are competent and comply with all the regulations. Ultimately, it's about protecting the public health. So ELAP enforcement as the staff and the unit is really well positioned to meet that charge. And we have expertise in lab operations and chemistry and micro data validation, the review of data and analysis. We have fraud and criminal investigations experience. Next slide. So I'm going to go into some like our main efforts as the ELAP enforcement team. So one of the main things we are trying to do is to stop and prevent fraud. So we realize that fraud can provide an unfair advantage to the labs that are following the rules, and so we want to stop and prevent that. And that serves to level the playing field for those labs that are doing good business. We want to enforce mandatory notification and reporting requirements. We also want to provide corrective actions for deficiencies for laboratories. We compel compliance to the use of enforcement tools, which we'll go over. And one of the things we always keep in mind in enforcement is maintaining separation of functions. So when we're working on enforcement cases, those are only visible to those that are in the enforcement unit. All right, next, please. All right, so let's meet the team. I wanted to, everybody knows Christine, our program manager. I'm Michael Head, the supervisor of the Program Development Research Enforcement Unit. And I also wanted to point out that we have a quality assurance officer that was recently hired, Jennifer Holmes. She comes from the private sector and brings a wealth of quality management experience to ELAP. And while she doesn't work on enforcement cases, the efficiency gains and the quality mindset does really inform our work in enforcement. But let's meet the enforcement team. Next slide. All right, so we have 4 staff working on enforcement cases. We have our most senior environmental scientist, Naeem Ahmad. We have Leanne Castle, who is the chair of ELAPCon 2024. We have Karen Black, your MC. And we have Naklu, our newest member of the team. Next slide, please. So now that we know what world we're in, so the world of ELAP enforcement, and we've introduced the team, we want to talk now about regulations that guide our work, and then we'll get into a little bit of how we do our work, how we process referrals, perform investigations. We'll talk about our enforcement toolbox, and then we'll go into some of the trends that the enforcement unit has observed recently and dig into those a little bit. And then we'll close with some high-level strategies for compliance. Next slide. All right. So I want to talk briefly, just touch base just really briefly at the regulatory basis for ELAP enforcement. So we have the Health and Safety Code, these sections here, and the CCR, the California Code of Regulations, of which TNI standard is incorporated by reference. Next slide. All right. So here is the applicable section that gives ELAP enforcement its ability to carry out the work. So section 100.865, I'm not going to read it all, but we're, as ELAP enforcement, we have the authority to enter and inspect labs that are accredited through ELAP. We can take photographs of the lab, the equipment, our activities and samples. We can request records and of reports, test results, that kind of information. Bullet 3 down there goes into the orders for information that we can request that you provide additional information. I didn't include all of the regs, of course. There's a lot of them, but the following ones kind of give guidance on what happens if you prevent us from doing our job or interfere with it in any way. And it's serious. I definitely recommend you take a look at that. Right. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk how now we went into the regs a little bit. So how do we do our work? So all enforcement cases start with a referral. After that referral is processed, we move into an investigation. Generally speaking, investigations can include those requests, those orders for information, getting more information from the labs. They include site visits, so going on site into the lab and checking things out. They can then include enforcement actions, and also we are starting to initiate proactive visits for enforcement as well. So let's dig into our work a little bit more. Next slide. So when a referral comes in, and I'll explain how that happens, we get them from complainants, and those complainants can include what you see here. So Division of Drinking Water staff, we get them from internal ELAP staff and other state agencies. We get them from staff at ELAP labs and their clients, contractors, and vendors. We also get referrals from concerned members of the public and sometimes anonymous complaints. All right, so let's go into how we get them. So the mode, the most common by far, the mode of receipt is email. And so this is what you see here is a screen clip of ELAP's website, ELAP's homepage, and on the right side of that homepage is under the banner Report a Laboratory. It links our technical inbox. So a lot of our referrals come through the technical inbox. They also can come directly to me. And so we see those a lot, but also we can get referrals by phone or in person. So next we'll talk about what happens after we get one. Next, thank you. All right. So referrals are logged into a tracking system that is, has a really unique name called the Enforcement Tracker. Those referrals are evaluated by me, and generally this is how it would go. So if there's not enough information in the referral, I'll reach out and get additional information, make sure we know what we're talking about. That is usually from the complainant. So I'll reach out to the complainant and find out more. If what we see in the referral or the complaint, if it's not regulated by ELAP, we'll refer that to the proper agencies. But once it is vetted, it is assigned to ELAP enforcement, and priority is determined. So we use a risk-based approach to determine priority. So we determine the severity and the scope of the issue with a focus on any public health impact. So we'll give it a priority. Sometimes there will already be a referral in our tracker, an active referral in the tracker for the same lab, and we can combine those if that makes sense. We also take into account recurrence. So has this happened before? And we'll talk about that more in just a second in the next slide. All right. So once one of the four investigators is assigned a case, it will start with a data gathering phase usually. So that can include phone calls, informal requests for records like emailing, orders for information. So the reason I included the little Mario graphic with the 1-up mushroom there is that if labs have a robust quality management system, this part will be relatively painless. If you don't, it might hurt a little bit, right? It might be hard to get the information to us. Something else that we do take into account that's not on the slide is what we talked about before, is we take into account recurrence. So, if this happened before, what was the previous corrective action? Why wasn't it successful in preventing the issue? And that'll be part of the investigation. We'll want to know that too. Sometimes a site visit is deemed necessary at that point. If we do come out to your laboratory, how it'll work is we'll come in and usually unannounced and ask to speak to the technical manager, the quality manager, and we'll sit down and go over why we're there, what to expect as far as how much time it will probably take, and often have a tour of the lab. So be prepared when we visit to provide documentation. So again, that's when a robust QMS system, a quality management system, is good. And often we'll want to speak to analysts doing the actual work. All right, let's move on. Okay, so after investigation is done, we then conclude that case. And so here are some of the things that are in our toolbox. Now, order for information that would happen before we concluded the case, of course, but we do have these levers, enforcement levers in our toolbox. So we can do notice of violations, notifying the lab of what they need to do better, and orders to correct. We can issue citations, monetary penalties for laboratories. We can issue suspensions, either partial or full suspensions for laboratories, and we can also revoke accreditation. Again, both partial and full. So those are some of the enforcement levers we have. Next slide, please. All right. So often, well, lately we've been identifying a lot of trends in the laboratory community, and so what we want to do with proactive visits is go out to laboratories that could experience this issue. Say if it's an issue with reporting micro data properly, for example, we could go out to laboratories that perform that testing and see how it's going for them. And so there'll be a narrow focus kind of scattershot approach and just get an indicator in the community of how that's going. And so we're doing that a little bit more lately. And I just wanted the community to be aware of that. All right, next slide. And so now you have some background of how we do our work. I wanted to go into some of the trends we're seeing, and we'll go over first some of the trends that we're seeing with T&I. All right. So enforcement trends for T&I. The big one really is lack of sufficient documentation. So if there is a requirement in T&I, the regulations are a T&I, that you're supposed to do something or in your own procedures, that you should have documentation to support that. So sorry, I'm getting distracted with the comments so apologies for that. So lack of sufficient documentation is kind of the big one. Lack of traceability, we've seen two, where one of the problems with traceability we've seen is with laboratories that have more than one location. On chain of custodies or on final reports, it's hard to tell where the work was being done, like what location was being done. We've also had some challenges with knowing what kind of sample it is, like whether it's a regulatory sample or not, and those kind of some traceability aspects. And lastly, we do see this quite a lot when we do on-site visits, that we see uncontrolled posted documents in laboratories. So things like checklists, things like a page of an SOP, right? Those things are fine to have, but they need to be controlled. So per T&I. So, they need to have effective dates. They need to be, it needs to be clear where they come from and that they are controlled. Right. So let's move on to some other trends we've been seeing, not related to T&I necessarily. So we'll go over 1, 2, 3 trends. The first one corresponds to the graphic that we see here. from Super Mario Brothers. Our princess is another castle. So next slide. So the first trend that we're seeing is with relocation. So for whatever reason, there are more labs on the move lately, and we've seen some issues with that. So I wanted to bring up the associated regulation in CCR about prior to moving, 30 days prior to moving, labs should be notifying ELAP with the information in that list. So that's not always happening. So we encourage if you are going to be moving, we encourage you to reach out 30 days before you're going to move and give us a plan. Next slide. All right, so during the change, so you're moving from the old location, going into the new location. For whatever reason, you may want to keep operating at the old location just to tie things up. But here, the regulations here are you need to comply with quality system requirements at the new location, and you can't be reporting at the old and the new location. And the new location, to get it to the point of being able to report data for regulatory purposes, that's what the next slide goes into. And so within 90 days after you move locations, you need to submit an amendment application that includes the things over there in the box. I just took the regulatory language and stuffed it over there to the side just for space reasons. But the important thing here is that labs, when they move, they need to have proficiency testing with acceptable scores for all their fields of accreditation. They need to have a completed on-site assessment, a successful on-site assessment. And before they can become accredited, and you need that accreditation before you can run regulatory work. So we like to give a fast food example for this. So say a sandwich shop, I like sandwiches. So a sandwich shop moves a location to a location with higher foot traffic. They want to make more money. So they have this passing health inspection at the old location. But they can't move and use that passing health inspection report at the old location to start selling food at the new location. They have to first pass that health inspection at the new one. So similarly, lab certification is tied to your location. So when you're moving to the new location, you can't run those regulatory samples until an approved amendment application is processed and a new certificate is issued. All right, so that was the first trend. So let's go into the second one that we're seeing. All right, technical manager. So we're seeing, we do see periodically changes to technical manager. And so the reg here, 64812F, says that if a technical manager is absent for 35 consecutive days, then you need to notify ELAP. So we've seen some gaps there. Next slide. Why that's concerning for ELAP and for ELAP enforcement is that here are the responsibilities for the technical manager. So they're responsible for all analytical and operational activity. I mean, you labs, of course, know this, but responsible for all the analytical and operational activities in the lab, supervise all employees, and ensure the accuracy and quality of all the data. Those are really important things. So it's no surprise why having a qualified TM on site is required. So if you do know that you're going to have this gap, notify us, please. All right, and last trend is missed reporting and notification. So here is the sum of the associated section for notification in 64814. And this was mentioned in Chris's talk as well, but it's the laboratory, and there could be other requirements as well, and that's the responsibility of the laboratories to know those additional requirements. But going into some of them that we've seen, so if you're performing drinking water analysis, you need to notify within 24 hours if you have positive TC, FC, or EC, so microdata. And another one that we see is nitrate samples that exceed MCL. That does have a 24-hour notification requirement. So this is our most common, thank you. This is our most common referral. So if you're unable to make contact with your water supplier within 24 hours, then you need to call the water board. So they're also I didn't include them here, but they're also reporting ones that are missed as well. Next slide. All right, so what can you do as a lab to ensure compliance? So unlike this little graphic here, which shows a hidden 1-up mushroom, there are no secrets for compliance. So what are we, like as ELAP enforcement, what are we recommending that you do? Next slide, please. Okay, so there are some practical tips that we recommend. A lot of these are going to sound very familiar with Chris and Maria's talks. First one, so this is where the up, down, left, right little theme comes into play. So know and follow the regulations. So secondly, communicate with us. Ask us questions, report issues. If you see something, do something. That's kind of an enforcement mantra. If you know you have a potential issue, you can self-report. If you have an issue with a subcontracting lab, you think something is not being done properly, please report that. All right. Third, and as Maria mentioned, documentation. We know that the requirements for T&I really kind of focus on this. We have this new standard, but you have to demonstrate the ability that you are meeting it, and the only way to do that is with this documentation. And lastly, strive for continuous improvement. So it's all about evolving as a lab. There is no perfect end game you're shooting for. You just continually try to improve, to continually get better. All right, and to close it up, as the title states, compliance every day keeps enforcement away, and compliance equals success, as Mario shows here with a really nice jump at the end. And that completes my talk. Thank you very much. You can, if you have questions after this, feel free to contact me at the email listed. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great presentation. We have just a few minutes for questions. Do all of your referrals end in enforcement?
No, they do not. So as I mentioned when I went over when we get referrals, sometimes we send referrals out to other agencies. Sometimes we close them with no further action. Sometimes the complainant will have an issue, and it doesn't really amount to an enforceable thing. So definitely, for sure, not all referrals go into an active enforcement case.
Great, and just one more question before we move on. How long does an enforcement case take from start to finish?
You're going to love this answer. So it depends, right? So it can be really fast. So in the instances where I just mentioned, where say a complaint comes in, say an anonymous complaint comes in and there's no way to get a hold of the person and it just doesn't have enough information to be actionable, we can't do anything with that. And so that ends pretty much right away. It won't even go out to my team. Ones that get referred out, if those go really fast. However, there are other ones that are really long that could last a year or more. So it really depends. It depends on the nature of the case. It depends on the complexity, and it also depends on what we talked about, this priority, right? So if something has a high risk profile, gets a high priority, those tend to go faster.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for sharing your ever-evolving knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Next up to our ELAP conference stage is Special Agent Ewing. Special Agent Ewing joins us from the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and we are thrilled to have him join us today. He joined the FBI in 2021 and is currently assigned to the FBI Sacramento Field Office. Throughout his bureau career, he has worked on numerous investigations, including ransomware, industrial computer intrusion, business email compromise, and investigations into illegal darknet markets. I am certainly very excited for this presentation. Please welcome Special Agent Ewing to the ELAP conference stage.
Just make sure, can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, well, I'm Special Agent Ewing. I joined the FBI in 2010, not 2021. I'm not quite that old yet, but that's fine. So basically, I'm a special agent with the FBI. My main job is to work federal investigations. I am specially trained in cyber investigations, where I received some specialized training into SCADA systems, which lends itself into the infrastructure sector. So I have worked a couple different water cases, and I'll be referring to them because I just checked our file systems and they have been adjudicated, so I am allowed to talk about them now. But most of the stuff in the presentation is unclassified. You can receive a lot of the information yourselves. Obviously, this is not a classified presentation, and any comments that I have is my views alone and not the position of the FBI. So next slide, please. So the reason that we like to concentrate on all critical infrastructure for cyber matters, especially for water, is the same way for like water, electricity, manufacturing, farming, and everything else that's considered critical infrastructure in the United States. Water is relatively unique, as in it's not connected. So one water district in one city or county or just municipality, it does not necessarily connect to another one. So an attack within the internet on one sector does not necessarily spread to other ones. So that makes it relatively unique rather than the electrical system where it's all connected. So it's a little different to work with, which also leads to the water labs and water facilities have different regulations because they're not connected for a lot of the times. It just depends on kind of where they're at. So as far as the FBI's, the purpose of the presentation is to basically, we're going to talk about cyber intrusions and other things, and the cyber strategy for the FBI. I had to make sure I say it right. It is to impose risk and consequences on cyber adversaries through unique authorities, world-class capabilities, and ensuring partnerships building on a century of innovations. And basically what it says is, you know, the FBI has been doing kind of law enforcement for a while, and we are the main domestic agency for computer intrusions, which is hacking and other things like that. Where it kind of differs is we do not mitigate systems. So our job is to go after the criminals. Like that is our main purpose. So if your company or your lab is, you know, has some type of computer intrusion or an issue, like our job is to work with you to collect evidence to go after that individual, whether they be domestic or foreign. Foreign actors isn't necessarily out of reach for us, which kind of makes it slightly unique. We do have numerous offices overseas, and we work with foreign countries, depending on the particular country, to hold that subject reliable or, you know, have some type of punishment towards them. It gets very convoluted, unfortunately, within the cyber realm because coming from the internet, everyone kind of looks the same. All right, so next slide. So broad spectrum is the threats that you have. So this is kind of starts with the green and goes to the red as the threat matrix that you have. And this isn't, if you're in one little category, you're going to stay right there. Many people will, bounce around or have multiple categories at the same time. But we figured this is a good way to kind of understand, who is attacking you. So at the far left, you have the hacktivism. So this is, groups of individuals that their major purpose is to just, deface your website, do DDoS attacks, basically just immediately try to break things, destroy things for your particular sector. This could be environmental activists going after this. So just think of like a second they get into the network, they're going to immediately start breaking things because they get excited about breaking in. So not very well planned for most of them. They're just kind of the least capable of the groups. Going up from there is criminal organizations. So this is everything from business email compromises to just get money out of the organization to ransomware to lock things up. And we're going to cover a little bit this, further. But these well-organized, don't think of cybercrime as, it's just some guy that's in his basement and, he's just hacking on his computer and he's just going to get you and it's just one person. No, like for the ransomware groups in particular, like it's full organizations. You're looking at, this is their 9-to-5 job. This is what they're doing day in and day out. It is not just one person. Like many of the groups are 50 plus people. And they all have a different role to play into that ransomware organization. So it's good to have that kind of aspect when you're dealing with the cybercrime criminals. The next one is the insider threat, which is probably the most nefarious because they can, it's the people that we trust. It's your coworkers, it's your managers, it's your people that have recently been fired. People that know the organization, they know the protocols, they know how to get into the system, they know exactly what systems they know exactly what lab equipment they use, they know if a system is being patched or not. So this has a very high likelihood of doing damage because of basically the insider knowledge of the organization. So it's really something to consider that whenever there's an intrusion, one of the first things we, kind of ask is like, has there anyone been let go recently? Is there anyone, relatively disgruntled? More than usual, we're all relatively disgruntled. Again, that's a Ryan comment, not a FBI comment. So moving on from there, we have the espionage. So these are nation state actors or corporate actors. So they could be, just corporations that's their sole job is just to, steal information, trade secrets for other things. Normally, the espionage actors, their purpose isn't going to be destructive. Their purpose is to kind of go in and just collect information, that they can just use later on for their own purposes. Typically, it is one of the hardest things to find in the network because they have a very, very low presence. They will just sit on a network for years and years and years without doing anything, making any noise. They have a random ping that comes out every few months. So it's difficult to find on the forensics aspect. And going up from there, you have cyber terrorism. This is relatively new. It kind of came through during my career, and it is specifically terrorist organizations that train hackers to get in and destroy things. This differs from hacktivism due to they tend to be slightly more organized, and the purpose of their infiltration isn't necessarily to just, I'm going to deface something. They're looking to destroy data. For your aspects, it would be to control water flow, mess up filling, mess up readings, destroy lab equipment. Their whole purpose is to terrorize against the United States or, the water board in general for other reasons. And the last aspect is warfare. We have seen this. There's been a lot of news articles, but to use hacking basically as a warfare technique. So the purpose to go after water systems or water labs is to simply, if instead of sending boots on the ground or other means, something happens overseas and a nation state actor wants to harm the United States, attacking its infrastructure is going to be its aspect, which has been shown a couple times relatively recently. So, over that fun note, next slide, and we'll cover the anatomy of how an attack normally happens. All right, so this is the general anatomy. I'll use ransomware as an example. And this purpose is just so you're kind of knowledgeable about the steps, so you can be aware of what's happening. The first one is recon. Any good hacker is going to just learn about the organization. Go on LinkedIn, go on YouTube, go on Facebook, whatever that organization is a part of, try to join it. Reach out to the HR to try to get information there. This is just basic recon. It's open source for the most part. And sometimes it's as simple as someone calls the help desk and, for your lab, and they're talking to them and they say, hey, I'm looking to apply for where your guys are at. Where do you typically eat lunch? Is there food available easily where you're at? And you're like, oh, that's, easy to give out. But once you tell them that, oh, there's this nice sandwich place that's, within walking distance, now that adversary knows where the employees go. And if those employees have badges with access to the facility, it is relatively easy to copy those badges. Even if you're not wearing them, within 5 or 6 feet, you can, basically copy a badge. So that is the recon phase. So it's just gathering information. It has many different aspects, and it's probably where most of the time gets put in for successful intrusions is within the recon. So then you have the initial compromise. Honestly, typically this is, the email. Most compromises happen due to an email gets sent, someone's social engineered, they click on the email, and the intrusion happens that way. The purpose of the initial compromise is just to get access to the account. So once they get that foothold in, so that's the next step, is to establish that foothold. So you build that profile, you start looking around what file systems you have access to, what organizations, what databases, what directories you can do. And then from there, you want to escalate your privileges. So this is where you want to get system admin status. So your IT security, any administrator, this is where it kind of gets a little dicey because a lot of managers want to have admin privileges on a network, which is not the best security standing due to you want to have the most limited amount of admins on your system as possible, because once you get that admin privilege, you can do whatever you want in the system. That allows you godlike powers within a network. So once you get that escalated privileges, then you're going to do internal recon, so mapping out your entire network. And then when you're mapping out the network, you laterally move around the network. So then you're going into your directories, you're going into your shared drives, you're going into your, offsite storage, your email accounts and stuff like that. And then once you have admin rights and you moved laterally, then you can start making more accounts. So you make new employees that don't exist, or you assume old employees' accounts. For your particular sector, a good thing to think about is your vendor accounts. So most of your lab equipment now is connected to the internet if it's sufficiently, scientific. And in order to maintain those pieces of equipment that sometimes range in the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, they need security patches. And in order to do those security patches, you have vendors. So typically those vendor accounts don't have a password reset time. And sometimes those vendor accounts are set for a company and not a person. So just something to think about is those not only are the admin privileges something that they really look for to have, but if they compromise a vendor account, that's many times how they maintain their presence. So once they get everything that they want, they set up their accounts, that's when they can start exfiltrating data. So for ransomware, that's when they use to blackmail you, to say, hey, if you don't pay us this money, we're going to, post this on the dark web. And then they lock up your system and go through that process. But just know that once they exfiltrate your data, there's always going to be that they're typically going to have presence inside the system. So what do we hate to see, and I've seen it personally with a couple victims, is they get the ransomware, they say, oh no, we can't fix this. It's going to be $1 million to mitigate as far as rebuilding our system, rebuilding our network. We're just going to pay the ransom for such and such money, $100,000, and we're just going to write that off. So they pay the ransom, and then, wow, a couple months later, they get hit with ransomware again. Different organization, because they maintained that presence and they know that you pay now. So they're going to keep on going back to that trough. So the federal government doesn't recommend paying ransomware in general, but we understand that that is a business decision and that is not held against you for prosecution or working with law enforcement. All right, so next page. So effects of cyber attacks, you have for your particular sector, it's going to be, if you have the sector of maintaining drinking water, it could be to harm people. Like there's been a couple examples, and one of the examples that I worked on was to maliciously go after people. As far as testing water supplies, the effects could be just simply, people know that there's pollution in the water because there's manufacturing. So it could easily be the, organization is deciding to, what if we just pay off some of the lab employees to falsify some of the results? And then that, will allow them to, provide access. So the effects is, attack to critical infrastructure of the United States. Next slide. And then jumping around a little, business email compromise is one of the largest fraud sectors that we're seeing right now. So basically, whenever you get an email from anyone purporting to be high up in your organization, especially if you're working in finance, and they're saying, hey, we need you to do this. And if it's not a usual request, pick up the phone. It's one of those things that we see it happen so much of, hey, I changed my, my wire details for my paycheck. And then, hey, for the next month, that person's paycheck's going into a, crypto wallet. It's just one of those things that we see a lot of business email compromises where, they change the identifier. So instead of like water boards, instead of the OA, they would just put AA. So it's kind of hard to see, but they register the exact same domain. So it looks very official. They use the recon to make the signatures look right. So it's one of those things that if you start to feel weird about it, just pick up the phone and, verify it in any way that you can. Next slide, please. So a couple examples of actual ransomware attacks that affect water utilities. In 2020, there was a Greenville, got hit by Ryuk. That particular ransomware variant asked a 205 Bitcoin payments in 2020, that was the equivalent of $1.7 million. So when I'm saying that the ransomware groups and crime actors are, they do their recon, part of the recon is knowing how big is the company, how much money did they make, how much did they pay their executive officers. They use those numbers to make the ransomware. So again, it's when you're thinking about cybercrime, really don't think about the lone individuals. These are organizations and this is their one job. All right, next slide. And then we also have the malicious attacks. So this is the warfare example. So this is open source, but yes, sorry. Got to keep up with my own slides. So there was a cyber attack on Israel. So they attacked their PLCs, and that allowed a lot of issues with their system. Fortunately, the workers at the facility noticed the, weird stuff happening with their PLS at the time, and they were able to mitigate the issues. So no actual damage was done, but this was a, concentrated attack that happened on their system. So it's very good to just know that, sometimes, Israel does believe that Iran was responsible for these attacks. So, and it's honestly, it's extremely difficult to fight against an advanced persistent threat like a nation state. It's just the matter of, due to the water facilities being not connected, you want to make yourself less of a target. Next slide. And another example, this is an insider example. So in Australia, a employee that was angry at his employer set up his own little war driving system with monitors inside of his vehicle, and then drove around to the sites that he knew existed and then turned off all the systems, which resulted in raw sewage being dumped into the water supply and aquifer and causing a lot of issues. So that is, an example of someone using that insider knowledge of knowing exactly, hey, these are radio transmitters. I can buy this part and I know the commands to use, and that allows them to, do a lot of damage. So it's something to always consider, that when you have, knowledge going around, or I know for the kind of the cybersecurity realm, the second you put in your 2 weeks notice, they revoke your privileges. It's a thing that happens. And for my own personal example, I worked with an agent out in Kansas City, and it was a rural water district, and a employee that had access and was terminated about a week before literally got intoxicated and then used his go to my PC password, which everyone used at that particular rural PC or rural water district, and then used it to go in and start flipping switches to allow chlorine into the water supply. Luckily, the person on duty, they had a physical person there, caught it in time, which, still caused some damage to the system. But that was an example of their particular protocols was a kind of off the shelf, super easy. Oh, we could just use this one password and then we don't have to maintain it. But that causes issues later down the line if, someone wants to have a malicious access. Next slide, please. So some of the benefits of working with FBI, we are the lead agency for cyber intrusions. As far as private sector goes, we don't come in like the movies and TV shows have you believe in. We're like, oh, we're just going to start seizing servers and we're going to take all this stuff and we're going to go into your server room and just, yank the cables and everything. That's not how that works at all. If we're gathering digital evidence. It is purely, we are working with your IT department. Most of the time, your IT department is providing us the evidence copies of, here you go, here's a hard drive that has the, what we think is the system. And like I mentioned before, like our job is to collect the evidence to be used in cases or collect the evidence to be used in intelligence if it's overseas. As far as mitigation goes, to help the company get back up to speed and to fix their network, the agency that's in charge of that is actually Homeland Security. But you, being in California, also have access to Cal OES. So believe they have other resources for you. So next slide. So one of the major things is if we grab servers, we grab, not grab servers, but grab the data from the servers or grab, all these files, all that information is considered victim information. And we don't go in and be like, all right, well, does this violate this California regulatory thing? That's not our job. Our job is to look at federal crime and federal intrusions. So we're not the regulatory agency. We're not this aspect. You have to deal with all them separately. We're focused on who attacked this, how did they get in, and where are they? So a lot of times within the cyber realm, that's difficult to prove, but that's why we've been doing it for a couple hundred years. And that also says like we are not going to seize company assets. We have our own computers and hard drives. We don't need yours. All right, next slide. So these are some of the different cyber resources. CY Watch is the 24-hour command center for all cyber incidents, where you can reach out to them directly, and they will determine if it's a, oh no, we need to, wake people up and have them respond. If it's a active, ongoing intrusion. The next little bullet at the middle is the cyber task forces. So that is, all 56 field offices have cyber personnel that are specifically trained to, kind of being the, I guess, the case agents. So that's me. IC3, great little database. So any type of internet fraud or anything else reports to IC3. I use it quite frequently for all of my fraud investigations or just to get victims for existing intrusion investigations. It's a service that you can report all cybercrime to. The DSAC is the Domestic Alliance Council, and it's about the same thing as InfraGard, but it's basically we're providing avenues for people to connect with one another. For InfraGard, you get a security clearance, but it's the purpose is that we have security personnel talk to other security personnel without competing of like, we need to fight against each other. It kind of came about when the banking industry was getting hit a lot because, say, Chase Bank and Wells Fargo both had security people and they were getting attacked, and Chase was also getting attacked, and they wouldn't talk to each other because they're competing banks. So we try to provide an avenue for security people to talk to each other to share, threat intelligence. And the other is the Department of Justice. That is our enforcement arm for all cases that we bring federally. We do work with the local Attorney General's office for all of their, if we decide that we need to pass the case to go state. Next slide. These are some of the information sharing methods. So we post flashes and pens and other advisories. You'll get it from the FBI and also MISA and CSAC, I believe. MSISAC, there we go. I provided a couple pens for your particular industry that may be available to you. But these are just public sector. So when we start to see things, so the reason that we can now share things is because the Executive Order 13691, it's promoting private cybersecurity information sharing, which allows us to say, hey, this sector is getting hit by this particular avenue, you might need to check your system for this particular thing. This is a kind of a change, what used to be. So it's a good kind of step forward to help protecting America. And next slide, I think I'm done. So sorry, that was a lot of information. Also I want to kind of touch on like kind of false thoughts of, the TV and movies and other things kind of have you believe of like, there's just, it's possible to, have everything hacked of like, oh no, my phone and then my car and then my thermostat and everything around me is automatically hacked all the time the second I touch it. I'm not saying that's not possible, but the time and effort and money involved to actually do that is within the multiple millions of dollars. So it's extremely difficult to have a 0-day malware attack onto someone's system, because the second you use that one malware, then it gets patched. So that's why it's called a 0-day malware. It's not to make you, oh, everyone's after me, so I need to, put a hammer next to my fax machine in case it starts acting funny. It's just try to be more aware of things. If someone just out of the blue starts asking you kind of probing questions, you might want to just ask yourself, why do they need to know this type of thing? So it's just try to be more aware.
Thank you so much, Special Agent Ewing. We really appreciate your time and the presentation. We have just one question for you before we have to wrap up today. How can my lab protect against insider threats?
A lot of it's, so once an employee decides to leave, even if it's amicable, it is removing the privileges, having a debrief, that we see a lot of victim companies that successfully kind of navigate this. And the debrief could simply be, why are they leaving and stuff like that. And it's just, people understand that you have to protect the systems, you have to protect, if you have proprietary information or just your equipment in general. It's, having the mindset of, hey, when is the last time we performed a user audit of our system? Of like, how many users do we have on our system? It says 50. Well, we currently have 20 employees. So a lot of times you have old employees that are still in the system. Maybe their password was expired, but they're still on the system. So a lot of times that insider threat is people, having access after being terminated. But honestly, the insider threat is a lot of just awareness of, people may get approached and asked to spy or do other things. Typically, you won't see it in your aspect. We see it in our aspect because of the national security secrets. But insider threat is probably one of the harder things to go after or prevent.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us today. Day one has been such a success, and we're sure everyone would agree. We hope you can join us tomorrow for our second day of ELAP Con 2024. You won't want to miss the evolution in action. We'll start the day off tomorrow with a presentation from our evolutionary duo, Wendy Link and Dan Newton, on the evolution of PFAS. Then we'll move straight into a presentation from Kelvin Yoon on the future of laboratory operations. He'll be filling you in on the shift that his laboratory has made to automated workflows. From there, we'll head into a presentation from Sam Hollis on droplet digital PCR for beach water quality monitoring. And then we'll finish off with a presentation from Nock Lee and Terrence Egan that will cover their laboratory's experience in going paperless and achieving TNI compliance for sophisticated technologies. With that, we want to thank you for spending your morning with us, and we look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow at 9 a.m.